Great. Welcome everybody to a special hearing of the Joint Pension Committee. I am the House Chair, Delegate Brooke Learman. Also so delighted to have Senator Sarah Elfreth here, our Senate Chair, and joined by many members as well as our Council and State Retirement and Pension team. We are here today because of an unprovoked invasion into a democratic country by Vladimir Putin and Russia. We are incredibly concerned about our democratic allies in Ukraine. We know we have a number of Ukrainian Americans here in Maryland, including one of our very own, Delegate Resnick. But we also are very concerned about our pension investments. And so we are here today to talk with the system and better understand where our pension investments are, what types of holdings we have in Russia, who those holdings are with, and a plan to move forward to ensure that we are being good fiduciaries and safeguarding our retirees' dollars. Now I'm happy to turn it over to my co-chair, Senator Sarah Elfreth.
Thank you, Chair Learman, and thank you to all the Joint Committee members for joining. We have a hard stop at about 12:58 because all of us have to be in committee. Delegate Learman went over the agenda. We will have an opportunity for questions as briefly as we can. And I just want to emphasize Chair Learman's thoughts here. We want to make sure that Maryland is not contributing to an international crisis. And so the dual role of ensuring the sustainability of our pension system, but also ensuring that we are not contributing to an international crisis with our pension funds. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Martin Novin, who's the Executive Director of the State Retirement Agency, to tell us about where our investments lie, the federal requirements that just came out last week, and anything else we need to know about investments we have in Russia.
Thank you, Madam Chairs and members of the committee. We appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. Applaud the committee for treating this issue with the urgency that it requires. I also do want to recognize the leadership shown by the Comptroller and the Governor, who have raised this issue as well, and appreciate the opportunity to work with all of you to try to address the concerns that we have, not just from a policy perspective, but also based on our exposure to Russia. We did have, and I think a number of you saw, it was public, that we had, it was reported that as of the beginning of February, in the middle of February, we had $197 million of assets in Russian securities. That represented 1/3 of 1% of our portfolio. And that number has decreased by both our divestment activities and also devaluation of some of those investments. So right now that we're looking at $32 million of investments that are in Russian securities. Of those, $7 million are actively managed in separate accounts that we control. $600,000 of those assets are in OFAC sanctioned companies. It'd be we've been working hard to divest from the entire portfolio. As we're looking at our investments, obviously we were able to get ahead of the market on a number of them and doing some divestment activity before the invasion occurred. So right now we have those $7 million remaining. We are not able to manage those assets in the divestment quite as efficiently as we can Sudan and Iran, and that's because in 2008, the General Assembly empowered us to do more for divestment from those companies and gave us the tools we needed to manage those more effectively. Now, some of the companies that we've divested from in Iran and Sudan are also companies that are now interests in Russia that we're looking to divest from. So actually that authority that you gave us in 2008 helped us manage this crisis better as well. So we welcome this conversation. We'd like to work with you. We thought that was a great model for handling a situation like this. We've been able to use it effectively. And with that, Andy Palmer is with us. He can get into all the details of the numbers to the extent you want to dive deeper. But we'll take those questions. One of us will answer any questions that you have.
We appreciate your efficiency.
Yeah, thank you. That was very helpful.
I thought that was desired.
Yeah, no. I think one initial question that I have, and then happy to turn over to Senator Elfreth and Delegate Resnick, is if you could talk a little bit about the committee of the federal requirements right now We have seen several federal directives come in. I understand, they have a list of entities that we should not be investing in and should divest from immediately. It would be helpful to know what those federal requirements say and where we are in complying with them.
Andy, do you want to take that?
Sure, I'll take those, and thank you. And just preface that the investment division and I share the concerns that the chairs presented at the beginning of the call here. But just in terms of the sanctions that have been put on, they have targeted 17 companies in Russia, and there's designed to impact the Russian economy as much as possible. And they have not sanctioned other companies because they are trying to maintain the flow of commodities like oil and gas to Europe and not have that be as a shock to the European economy and European people. The sanctions themselves are, in terms of the companies, don't allow foreign investors to give them additional money in the form of new issue securities of stocks or bonds. It does not preclude investors from trading them or owning them, as it did the federal government a year or so ago did with some companies involved with Chinese defense businesses. Those were barred from ownership by U.S. entities. That has not happened to date with these Russian companies. So the sanctions are targeted. It's designed to choke off capital for further activities in these companies, and has not required us to divest at this point. It may come to that, and they may change. The sanctions are changing every day. The market has kind of moved past it. Just as parenthetically, the market has moved past it. You see many companies themselves stepping away from Russia. The indices that sort of drive how we invest, we say we want to have investments in US or Europe or Asia or wherever it is, and then we look to benchmark companies to say these are the companies that are included in your opportunity set. MSCI and Russell have taken Russian assets out of the benchmark in a week or two. They'll come out of the benchmark, so our investment set will shrink going forward. So the market's kind of moving past or extending the sanctions that the federal government's put on.
That's helpful. Senator.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Mr. Novin. I don't want to call. I don't want to mess anything up, but would it be possible to get all the numbers that you just listed in writing to the Joint Committee, perhaps as soon as we can, just so we have a good record of where we were last week versus where we are now, and perhaps some of the challenges ahead?
Sure, we'll work to get those to you today if we can.
Okay, thank you very much. Delegate, I believe.
Delegate Resnick.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy and Martin and the rest of your team for this update. A quick question, and you did address this in some way, but I just want a little more clarity on it. We understand the direct impact of companies that are doing business with Maryland that may be Russian owned or Russian invested. The impact of direct of raw materials, however, it seems I'm not quite getting my head around. So you mentioned oil. There are others, rare earth materials, agriculture. Russia does tend to be a source of raw materials that go into production and refinement in various other parts of the world. So can you clear up for me how that process works with our pension fund and how divestiture might function there?
Let me see if so the question is, how does the federal sanctions on companies that are not involved in, I'll try to answer the question. I'm not sure I understand it. You can correct me. So
it's complicated, so I may not be asking it in the right way, but try and answer it, and I'll be happy with whatever you say.
Okay, so we invest in companies, and the companies themselves have relationships with entities in Russia. And some of the companies we are directly in Russian companies. So there are nickel companies and oil and gas companies such as Lukoil, Rosneft. Those are large companies that are supplying oil and gas to the Europeans. And other rare earths, as you mentioned, nickel, aluminum are important manufacturing staples. So to impact, the sanctions were designed to try to minimize the impact on those companies. And so even the banks that have been targeted for being taken off of SWIFT are not banks that are facilitating those transactions. So in terms of the pension plan, if we divest from all Russian companies, then we're not exposed to any of that activity, whether it's sanctioned activity or non-sanctioned activity.
Okay, I see. So if Rosneft or another Lukoil or somebody else sells raw crude to Chevron or to BP or whomever, that's not what we are considering in this process, right? We're not considering, right? That's a little problematic for me because honestly, that's where they're getting most of their revenue from. That's the big hurt.
Anecdotally, what I hear, Delegate, is that the counterparties are reluctant to engage because they're not sure if and how they're going to get paid or if the sanctions will change. So the activity is really just kind of drying up, from what I understand from news reports and other sources.
Interesting.
Thank you. Senator Rosepep.
Thank you. I got two questions. One is, strategically, are we only talking about divesting investments that are directed by the federal government's rules, or are we talking about making independent decisions in Maryland based on our evaluation of the market?
That's a great question.
Well, I guess that's a policy question. So
Martin, do you want to address that?
No, I'm happy to address that. There's $32 million of investments that are with Russian companies, and of those we actively so of those 32 million, only 7 million is where we own those assets directly, as opposed to being in a mutual fund where we don't control those holdings. So what we control is $7 million. That $7 million includes the $600,000 of investments in those OFAC sanctioned companies. We're talking about the $7 million. We're talking about all of those companies in which
beyond the federal rules.
Yes,
Yeah.
the federal rules.
That addresses my question. Okay. I got a second question. How you calculate what our investments are in Russian-related assets? I presume, like BP, they're invested in Russian oil business. We're probably invested in BP. That's one example. Second example, I'm sure we're invested in hedge funds. I mean, we must have hedge funds that are trading in bad debt. Going to be a lot of bad debt in Russia in the next couple of months. Are we going to be investing in buying bad debt in Russia? I mean, help me understand. Are we just talking about direct investment in individual companies, or are we talking about entire engagement with investment products and platforms related to the Russian economy?
So that's a great question, Senator, and it goes back to the original sanctions that we have with Iran and Sudan. And in those cases, we are looking for companies that are doing business in Iran and Sudan. In this case, we are not looking at the companies who have been engaging with Russia. We are looking at directly Russian the companies located in headquarters and operating primarily in Russia, as opposed to companies who have.
That sounds much narrower.
That's much narrower, yes.
And why are we looking so much more narrow?
I think there's two parts. The two-part answer to that question would be, one is that we have data readily available, but what companies are for Russian companies. Two, that is the approach that the federal government has taken. They have not instructed companies not to transact with Russia, which is the case they had with Sudan and Iran. So we're following the federal policy there. And third, it might not be fiduciarily prudent to do that because there's so many companies and such a large part of our portfolio would be impacted by such a restriction. And to your answer, it probably within funds like a hedge fund or something like that, where we don't have control about what's inside there probably will be managers who try to take advantage of the disarray here and make money on the other side of whatever happens with Russia.
Senator Rosepep, I appreciate your concerns, and I think, Andy, just building off of Senator Rosepep's question, is this a place for engagement? We kind of have to triage. We're going to address the direct investments now, but perhaps engagement is the next best step for the larger companies like a BP who clearly have interest in Russia? Is that a place that the system could be engaging in those with those larger investments in their engagement with Russia?
Yeah. Delegate Mangione.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess the question, for my knowledge, is a decision like this, is it in the form you said of a bill earlier? Is that how we're going to decide this? And I guess, is that how we've done it in the past? I really don't know. Because like just one thing I bring up, for example, is, and some of us may agree or may not agree, but the nation of China and their Chinese government, for example, has had lots of human rights abuses, that they've had, obviously, allegations that I tend to believe. They've how they handled coronavirus, what they knew and did not know, and a number of things, slave labor, and obviously a lot of our jobs going over there. I'm just trying to make a comparison. Is something like this done, if I wanted to? I'm not saying I will or not, but is that something I would bring as a bill also? Do we have investment there? I'm just trying to figure out how this works, and I'm totally for it. And I agree with what we're trying to do, but I'm just trying to be equal on how we handle some nations that are obviously going against what we generally believe here. If that makes any, if that question came out there.
Sure, Delegate Mangione, my understanding of your question is this an appropriate place for legislative action? And I think
I'm not questioning that. I'm sorry. I'm simply saying, is that how we do it? I don't know. And like, so that's what is happening here. You said, I missed the very beginning. Did you say it will be a bill?
I did not. So Director Novin, could potentially ask or tell us if legislation would be helpful to the system, like it was during the Iran and Sudan, when we in 2008 passed legislation to help provide options for the system. And in addition, I think that, yes, if you are interested in learning more about any investments that the system has in other countries, then that's certainly something that you can ask the system about. And if you believe that those are countries that we should not be doing business in, you can put in a bill about that. So, yes.
Thank you very much for helping me understand. I appreciate it.
Yep. Director Novin, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm happy just to say that one thing that generally we don't, the system doesn't invite a lot of divestment type of legislation because we want our investors, right, the folks that do the investing of our $70 billion portfolio, to be thinking about returns and serving our members. And we don't want them to be making different decisions based on policy considerations as a rule. When it came to Iran and Sudan, it was helpful, and it is helpful right now, because we don't want our investors we want them to be technicians. We want our managers to be technicians. We want them to be colorblind when it comes to these types of policy issues and just focus on making returns. It makes it very hard when we have an exceptional situation like this or like Iran or Sudan to act. So legislation helps our people when they're doing their work consider policy considerations that we would not want them considering on their own. We would not want them to decide they don't like a certain thing or a certain product or a certain country and making these decisions on their own. They can't. We would own our managers doing that. So what this does is, in the exceptional situation where the General Assembly concludes that action is appropriate, we would prefer to have it in the form of legislation so that we have a clear directive and our staff can function as objectively, but include that in their considerations.
That's very helpful, Mr. Novin. Senator Rosebud, is your hand remaining from before? Or
no, it didn't. No, it went up again, Madam Chair.
Okay, could you just quickly? We have about 5 minutes.
Very quickly, I want to address Delegate Mangione's point. China does lots of terrible things, but we should not conflate those issues at this point. What Russia's done is a huge threat to the world economy, to our entire structure of government in the West and the East. And so I want to be careful that we don't conflate a lot of other problems with Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
Okay.
Thank you. That's
very helpful. Chair Lehman, I want to just reemphasize Mr. Novin's comment here that the system can make these decisions, the board can vote to make these decisions. I think we've heard encouragement from the comptroller, from the governor. Of course, that encouragement is not a directive. Really, only the General Assembly could direct, and just want to set expectations for this joint committee moving forward.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming together on short notice. This really is an unprecedented situation. Thinking through the history books, it's hard to imagine, it's hard to remember or recall a time when the world's financial markets have acted so quickly, including Switzerland, from Switzerland to United States, the EU, and across the globe, to a situation to condemn this unprovoked invasion. And also, it's our duty, right, to ensure that our retirees' pension investments are safe, not just today, but in the future. And so that's why we're here, to make sure that we're staying abreast of all ongoing investments and continuing to educate ourselves to represent our constituents and fulfill our duties. So thank you, Director Novin and Andy, for joining. Chair Elfreth, would like to close us out.
Yeah, just one more note. I want to thank the system for joining us, every member for joining us, the public in particular. Mr. Novin, as soon as you have everything in writing that we asked for today, we will share that with the Joint Committee. And I would just ask, considering how fluid the situation is, that the Joint Committee kind of be on alert for further action as determined from this hearing briefing.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.